Hi, I'm Therese Raphael with Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm delighted to be joined by the writer and journalist Jonathan Ford, who's written on climate change and energy subjects, among many other topics, very thoughtfully, and will be joining us today to talk about net zero, the energy crunch that is being faced by Boris Johnson as he returns to Britain from the UN General Assembly, which he's addressed, and other subjects. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you.
We've been trying to find some time to talk for quite a while after you wrote a long feature for Bloomberg Opinion entitled, "Can Boris Johnson Sell Net Zero to the British Public?" So we're going to unpack some of the issues that you addressed in that feature. But first, I'd like to talk about the climate, political, economic facing Boris Johnson as he returns from New York. And that is to say the energy crisis that we've seen sweeping through Europe as wholesale prices have risen. We've had a number of suppliers, retail suppliers fold. By my count, it's been 9 this year, over 1.5 million British customers. Can you unpack for us a little bit how that fits in to the broader decarbonization agenda? What are the policy challenges that this poses for Boris Johnson as we head toward this crucial COP26 summit?
Okay, well, I think it's fair to say it's not helpful to have a kind of 1970s style energy crisis explode out of on your watch, just as you're warming up for the COP26 summit, and that's, I think, what we have. Is there a? I mean, I suppose where I start from is I have to say, although I think that the government no doubt will get a lot of criticism for various things and will be forced to, a bit like the early stages of coronavirus, to do a lot of kind of slightly inept kind of quick fixes to problems as they arise. I think it's fair to say, though, that the problems that are really being exposed now by what you described, which is essentially a massive increase in wholesale energy prices in Europe, have clearly afflicted Britain more than many other countries. And that's partly due to not really any decisions that Boris Johnson himself has taken. It's to do with a long tail of poor policy making and decisions over a long period. And he's kind of just reaped, if you like, a bit of a whirlwind from those past decisions. And the way I would characterize it is that energy policy in the UK has been sort of built on 3 kind of planks over a long period. And one is it's got to be reliable. You've got to have, flick a switch and the power comes on. It's got to be affordable. So people can't have too high prices, which is why we have price caps in the UK. And those have been a feature of the scene for about a decade. And it also has to contribute to cutting emissions. And what we're discovering now is that those 3 planks are not really very compatible. You can do 2 of them, but sometimes you can't do all 3 at the same time. As far as what things need to be done, the problem for Boris Johnson is they're quite fundamental. They're things like you've got to think about, you've got to have more energy capacity, and you've got to think more hard about energy security. So one of the triggers for this crisis is that over a long period, governments in Britain took the decision to make up the shortfall in energy capacity, generating capacity in the UK by importing power from other countries, notably through an interconnector to France. Now, about 10% of our electricity comes from that source, and now one of those pipes has blown up. So, and it will take 6 months to fix. Now, that's a problem, but it's not a problem you can fix tomorrow. I mean, you're going to have to do all sorts of, as I say, inept sort of short-term measures to get around the problem over winter. But getting out of this swamp is the work of some time. And to come back to your question, it clearly doesn't help with the whole decarbonisation agenda, it makes it more difficult, because if prices are higher, people are going to be more sensitive to the costs of doing things which they may have to do to reduce emissions.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be the real conundrum for the government, and the narrative that we've heard since the energy prices began to spike. And we know Ofgem, the UK regulator, has increased the cap, which I guess the new cap goes into effect next week, I think. And the narrative from the government is, look, this has been a perfect storm of problems. As you mentioned, you've had a fire, we've had spiking demand in Asia, we've had weird weather patterns, and it goes on, and that's caused the wholesale price spike. Both Boris Johnson and Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, have said, look, these are probably quite temporary. Consumers will be protected. And they've also, they've been quite harsh on some of these businesses that have gone under. We're not going to prop up loss-making businesses. Now, from the industry perspective, they've said, okay, yes, some of them were reckless, some of them were unhedged or thinly capitalized, and were really unprepared for the kinds of spikes. However, as you've just noted, there's this whole regulatory overlay that's added cost to the sector. There's a price cap that has forced, and I think Ofgem regulator said to a parliamentary committee yesterday that the majority are now making a loss. They are providing electricity at below the cost to them of supplying it. So, that certainly presents this trilemma that you've outlined. The government is now going to have to make some choices, right? But it said they're sticking with the price cap. They're not going to prop up the failing suppliers. That seems to leave the larger companies, the EDFs and Centricas, to mop up these consumers that have been stranded by the failing suppliers. Do we risk then getting the very sort of concentration that deregulation, was intended to resolve, so that there would be more competition? And I'm just wondering, going back to the broader agenda of decarbonization and net zero, and we'll come back to your article where you talk about innovation and technological advance. We're going to need small, nimble, creative, tech-centered companies to drive those changes. Is that, are we in danger of kind of losing those if we've got, as you say, protecting consumers but keeping regulation in place? Is that the conundrum that needs to be sort of solved right now? And is the answer, bringing more energy mix into the picture, or
more energy what?
A sort of a more energy mix. So
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but I mean, just to go back to the starting point, what you call a trilemma. If you start by saying we're going to stick with all three principles, you're not going to change anything. I mean, it's basically, and it may be temporary, right? But the issue is we live in a modern society where the provision of reliable power is really important, and it also that it's not ruinously expensive is something which people expect. And I think the first thing that will happen is if you stick with the cap at anything like the current level, it's clear that politically lifting the cap in the middle of an energy crisis or sort of price spike will make the government unbelievably unpopular. So that's not what they're going to do. But in the long run, they have to think about it, because the cap is economically illiterate. What you have is you're saying to people, you're saying to utilities who are losing money, you've got to invest at 5 times the rate you've historically been investing in. What's their incentive? So effectively what you're stuck with is then you're stuck with issuing subsidies to people to build plant. And funnily enough, not a single piece of electrical kit has been built in the UK for about a decade without any subsidy. and there's no sign that any will be in future. So I think there is. I think clearly in the short term, I think you're right. I think politically they're in a difficult place because doing things which will clearly and visibly put up costs for consumers is hard. I mean, there are clearly going to be the caps going up because Ofgem has to recognize reality that the utilities need to get paid, otherwise they're going to get bust, all of them, and then they won't have anyone to transfer the customer accounts to. But that question of how you get this additional capacity will have to be faced at some point, and the reality is it will probably have to be faced by customers paying more than they currently do for their power.
Yeah. And that's a conversation we haven't really gotten to yet in this country. So there's a lot of talk about net zero. We have the 10-point green plan, but there really hasn't been a robust, sort of honest conversation that says who is going to bear the cost. But and I don't want to come on to cost because I think that that's the crux of it all, isn't it? But maybe let's back up a little bit and ask, how far along are we on this path to net zero 2050? This is, I think the UK was the first country to put that in legislation. So Boris Johnson is now legally bound to pursue that.
Yeah.
Where are we on that? Where is he? And as he goes into this COP summit.
Well, we've got some way. The government will always point to the quite impressive looking declines in carbon emissions on a territorial basis. Mm-hmm. Of course, people who think about these things in a slightly more in what you might say a more logical way, point out that territorial emissions don't really matter if effectively you're essentially just exporting all your carbon production to other parts of the world. And so in consumption terms, of course, the picture is not so good. But let's put that to one side. We've got some way. We did quite a lot in electricity, but what we did there was all to do with corporate investment. So the government went to companies which produced electricity and said, we want you to invest in renewable power, and we will give you a contract that will guarantee you a return from doing this piece of investment. And the companies did it. And it was a kind of stealth tax because it was quite a lot, but it didn't move the dial spectacularly, although it is to some extent contributing to the problems we're now experiencing. But that was easy because effectively the government goes to a small number of utilities and some landowners and some entrepreneurs in the energy space and says, do this. And the public kind of gets its pocket picked and doesn't really realize, but it's fine. What they're now going into, now electricity is only 20% of total energy in the UK. The other 80% are things like transport and heating. And that's where you have to start interacting directly with lots and lots of millions of people making purchasing decisions. And that's harder because I might buy an electric vehicle if it's considerably more convenient than the car I have and it's cheaper, but neither of those things necessarily really apply at the moment. I might change my central heating system to a heat pump and a heat battery of the sort I wrote about in that article. But the problem is it's going to cost me a small fortune and it's actually not as efficient. It's an immature technology. It's not as efficient as what I have. Oil and gas are really quite efficient and convenient for the public. And so therefore the government has to find a way of articulating to the wider public, you need to make these changes. Lots and lots of you need to make these changes. And it has to work out how much is it all about carrot, i.e. this is going to be better, and how much of it is stick, which is just there's a switch off. And history shows that these are difficult things to do. I can only really think of two in my lifetime, probably many more, but the only two I can think of, one was analog to digital TV. And that kind of, the government set about a decade for it to happen. And digital TV came along and there was a lot of innovation and it got cheap and it got a lot better as a product than the old sort of fat telly sitting in the corner of your room. And so that kind of worked. the other one is the switch from town gas to natural gas in the 60s and 70s. That took 20 years, and that was just compulsory. There was no choice for consumers. They were just told, the engineer is turning up in your house on September the 17th, and he will be turning you over to natural gas. So the government, you kind of sense that the government, these are long-term problems, and you really need to think about how you talk to people. And my concern is there's really very little sense among the general public of what the government's strategy really is, other than, you know, Boris sort of talking in vague and rather enthusiastic terms about jobs and science.
Yeah, you know, you've just brought to mind the way we talk about so much about how much progress has been made already, or at least you hear the government talking about it. But as you say, those costs were very much hidden, and they came in the form of, you know, improved home insulation and more efficient gadgets. So there were a lot of technological advances. They were maybe a bit regressive in some ways, but on the cost side, but people didn't really notice. And this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where people have to make real decisions. And I think you profiled in your piece, I don't know if we call it, you know, an engineer who's come up with this very interesting battery. And the cost was, what was it, £10,000 about?
Well, so his battery is kind of part of the answer. So if you wanted to switch from your no doubt splendid gas boiler to what he would propose, which would be a battery and a heat pump, it would cost you more than £10,000 more. So essentially, instead of your £2,000 boiler, which is really easy to get fitted because there are lots of engineers who know how to do it, you would have to get your heat battery and the heat pump, which would probably cost you about 10 to 12 grand. And then on top of that, and one of the reasons it would be more expensive is there are very few engineers who know how to fit heat pumps, because there are almost none being fitted in the UK at the moment. And then probably on top of that, because it's not as an efficient a system, someone would come to your house and say, actually, you need to put new windows, doors, insulation in, and which would reduce the size of your house and would basically be a major work which would disrupt your life. And how do you sell? I mean, I don't know. How do you sell that? I think it's tough. And clearly the sort of people who are doing it are people like the sort of people who buy Teslas. They're people who are well off and want to do their bit. And those people, great, but they're not going to solve the problem.
No. And what about looking at other areas where emissions are high, say agriculture? You know, is that just too politically difficult for the government to, you know, we've been told we have to reduce the amount of meat and dairy that we consume. That's part of the net zero target. Agriculture is a big source of emissions. And yet, you know, I think, is that another area where, you know, politically it's just too difficult?
Well, I think it touches on, it touches on an interesting aspect of carrot and stick, because of course, very interesting fact, which I only became aware of very recently. I mean, I have two daughters, but one who is periodically a vegetarian, and I had assumed that there was a kind of generational change going on, and the younger generation ate a lot less meat than I do. And then I discovered that in fact it's totally the reverse. They are eating more meat than we ever did.
Is that right?
And it's totally counterintuitive given the volume of political discourse one gets on the subject. But so if that behavior change doesn't come about because people just sort of think we should do something differently, which is from the government's perspective the gold sort of standard solution, then you have to look at things like economic kind of incentives for people to use less meat. And Boris Johnson was asked some months ago, what about meat taxes? Because we've got to get on with this. We've got to reduce meat consumption by 20% by 2030 or something. And he said, absolutely not. And that's the interesting thing about this government under this prime minister, I think, is that there are two sides to. I mean, a lot of people have talked, you know, this week because of New York about does he really believe this? Didn't he write years ago about how it was all a hoax or a conspiracy and it was all nonsense? I don't think that's the interesting question. I think the interesting thing about Boris is that there are two sides. First of all, he's a libertarian, and I don't think the stick appeals to him very much. He doesn't like telling people you must not. What he does like is he likes infrastructure and he likes science. And so I think the focus of this government will be much more on, sort of giving kind of R&D bungs to lots of companies to come up with brilliant ideas, and lots of sort of boosterism, and less of the or a kind of. But what there won't be, I don't think, or not yet, is a real a way thinking hard about how to address the question of how do you ultimately get people to make the switches when the technologies we're talking about, the technologies we routinely talk about, are really still quite immature. And
for example, hydrogen. I mean, maybe you could just speak briefly about hydrogen. I know we're running low on time, and then we can come back to this. But we hear a lot about hydrogen. Yeah. The government wants to encourage investment in hydrogen. It's clearly part of the solution, but how big a part?
Good question. I mean, hydrogen is a very small part of the energy mix at present because it's expensive. Making renewable hydrogen makes it a lot more expensive. So. And so therefore, if you think about the sort of people who will use hydrogen, transport, industry, what you're really saying is your costs are potentially going to go up very high. And there is no alternative to bearing those costs, because that's the only solution we can think of. So I think that the pressure on hydrogen is clearly the cost does have to come right down. And it's going to be an increased cost anyway. I mean, it's going to put up costs for industry, and the government has to think through how it encourages. I mean, how do you encourage a manufacturer to invest in hydrogen and changing his plant when he's probably going to be out of business in 3 years if, China targets his market with lots of cheap products which don't have the same environmental standards? So once again, those sort of issues haven't really been tackled, but it's clear that the government will, as I think they've announced, want to push R&D in this sector in the hope of finding, an answer. Possibly, the answer people talk about is maybe nuclear energy, because it creates heat which can make electrolysis more efficient. But that's years off. It's not going to happen tomorrow.
And we have aging, fairly unreliable nuclear facilities. They're going offline. It will be years before we get replacements.
And we've only got one replacement.
Yeah, exactly. Only one, the Hinkley, right? So, I mean, listening, to you lay this out, it occurs to me we have a government that is pretty adamant that consumer prices can't rise. We have a government that doesn't want to tax more, already has raised taxes on national insurance. We know that we have a population that's going to be facing rising costs for energy, in inflation, and other areas. And we have this net zero target. So, clearly something has to give. The idea of encouraging investment and technology, whether that is through deregulation, which we're not seeing in the energy sector, but maybe that will come, or tax relief somewhere. And that's also hard to see. But, I think that's one way about it, but it just sounds like it's not going to get them there. Boris Johnson said in front of the UN General Assembly that Kermit the Frog was wrong to say that being green is easy, isn't easy. So being green is easy. I don't think he's going to find it that easy. I mean, it's one thing to say.
I think Kermit was right. I think Kermit was right, and I think I think costs will go up if we go down this unilateral route, which is what the law commits the government to do, and behaviour will have to change. But somebody's going to have to tell the public sooner or later what the consequences are.
Kermit gets the last word. And thank you very much, Jonathan. It was lovely speaking with you and very interesting. Hope we can do it again.